Number 1. Kuelap. High in the northern mountains of Peru, wrapped in a permanent shroud of cloud, there is a fortress that most of the world has never heard of. It sits on a limestone ridge in the Amazonas region, at an altitude of about 3,000 meters, nearly 9,900 feet above the sea. The air is thin here. The mist never fully lifts, and out of that mist rise walls of gray stone that reach as high as 19 meters, about 60 feet, taller than a 6-story building. The people who built this place called themselves, or were called by others, the warriors of the clouds. We know them as the Chachapoya. They raised Kuelap on this ridge beginning around the 6th century of the Common Era. That is more than 1,000 years before the first stone of Machu Picchu was ever set. Think about that gap in time as we go. The fortress you have heard of is the young one. The scale of Kuelap is difficult to grasp. The great oval platform it encloses runs about 600 meters long. Engineers estimate the site holds roughly 3 times the volume of building material found in the Great Pyramid of Giza. That is around 25 million cubic feet of stone, hauled up a cloud forest mountain by people with no wheels, no iron tools, and no draft animals. And they built it to be entered only on their terms. There are just 3 ways in. Each one is a narrow, funnel-shaped passage that squeezes down until only a single person can pass at a time. Imagine attacking that. Your army arrives at the base, and to get inside, you must file in one by one into a stone throat with defenders waiting above. It is a killing corridor by design. Inside the walls once stood more than 400 round stone houses, their outer faces decorated with zigzag and rhombus patterns. And near the center sits a strange inverted cone of stone the locals call El Tintero, the inkwell. No one is certain what it was for. Some say a solar calendar. Others say a ritual chamber. A few suggest something darker, a place of sacrifice. The Chachapoya fought the Inca fiercely and were only subdued late in the 15th century under the Emperor Tupac Yupanqui. Even then, they rebelled. The fortress was rediscovered for the outside world in 1843 by a judge named Juan Crisostomo Nieto. Modern research, led since the 1980s by the archaeologist Alfredo Narvaez, has found burned buildings and human remains that hint at a violent end, perhaps a massacre, before the survivors were finished off by a new enemy. Not soldiers, smallpox. By the middle of the 16th century, the clouds had the fortress to themselves. But if Kuelap is the fortress no one remembers, the next one is the fortress no one can even reach. Number 2. Debre Damo. Travel now to the highlands of northern Ethiopia, to the region of Tigray, near the border with Eritrea. Here the land rises into flat-topped mountains the locals call ambas, and the sides of these mountains are sheer vertical cliffs. On top of one of them sits a monastery that has stood for roughly 1,500 years. And there is no path to it. There are no stairs. There is no road. The only way up Debre Damo is a rope. A long braided rope of leather, hanging down a cliff face about 15 meters high, close to 50 feet. To reach the summit, a second rope is tied around your waist, and the monks at the top haul you up, hand over hand, while you climb and scramble against the bare rock. That is the entrance. That has always been the entrance. Tradition holds that the monastery was founded in the 6th century by a holy man named Abuna Aragawi, one of the 9 saints who spread Christianity through Ethiopia. The legend says Aragawi did not climb the cliff at all. A great serpent, sent by God, is said to have lowered itself down and lifted him to the top. And there is a rule on that summit that has held for centuries. No women may ascend. No female animals either. The church that Aragawi is said to have built is one of the oldest surviving churches in all of Ethiopia. It is built in the Aksumite style, with alternating layers of stone and timber, and projecting wooden beam ends the Ethiopians call monkey heads. The plateau on top stretches about 1,000 meters by 400 meters, and for centuries it supported hundreds of monks who lived almost entirely self-sufficient, drinking rainwater collected in cisterns cut into the rock. This was more than a place of prayer. It was a stronghold. Aksumite kings used Debre Damo as a treasury, and even as a prison for royal rivals they wished to keep out of the way. Ancient gold coins from the Kingdom of Aksum have been found here, tying the site to one of the great trading empires of the ancient world, a power that minted its own money and controlled the Red Sea trade at its height between the 4th and 7th centuries. Everything on that summit had to come up by rope: the food, the building materials, the livestock, hauled up in slings. And because of that single, guarded point of access, Debre Damo was never taken by a conventional assault. The dry mountain air, more than 2,000 meters up, preserved its ancient timber and its illuminated manuscripts written in the old Ge'ez script. Its design would echo in later Ethiopian sacred architecture, including the famous rock churches of Lalibela. Defense by height is one thing, but the next fortress defended itself with something more frightening than any cliff: its reputation. Number 3. Alamut Castle. In the Alborz Mountains of northern Iran, on a narrow spine of rock about 2,100 meters high, sit the ruins of a fortress whose name still carries a chill: Alamut. The word is often translated as the eagle's nest, and for 166 years it was the heart of the most feared secret order in the medieval world. The ridge it stands on is only a few meters wide in places, with sheer drops on either side. A frontal assault was almost unthinkable. In the year 1090, a man named Hassan I Saba took the castle. He did not take it by storm. He took it by persuasion, slipping his followers inside and converting the garrison from within until, one day, the fortress simply belonged to him. Hassan was the founder of the Nizari Ismailis, a sect the wider world came to know by a darker name, the Order of Assassins. From Alamut and a web of sister fortresses across Persia and Syria, this small group waged a new kind of war. They could not field armies against the sultans and the crusader lords, so they struck at individuals. A single devoted agent, a fidai, would get close to a powerful man and kill him. It was terrorist strategy, and it worked far beyond their numbers. But Alamut was not only a nest of killers. It held a famous library, drawing scholars from across the Islamic world, including the brilliant polymath Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. Hassani Sabah himself is said to have lived inside its walls for more than 30 years, without once leaving his quarters, buried in study and administration. The fortress had cisterns and water channels cut into the rock, so it could survive a siege for a very long time. The legends grew. The traveler Marco Polo later recorded the tale of the Old Man of the Mountain, who was said to keep a secret garden paradise where young recruits were drugged and shown pleasures, then promised a return if they died carrying out his orders. Most modern historians treat this as embellishment, a hostile story told by the Order's enemies. Even the popular idea that the word assassin comes from hashish is disputed by scholars today. What finally broke Alamut was the one force that broke almost everything in its path: the Mongols. In 1256, the army of Hulagu Khan arrived, and the last Nizari leader, Rukn al-Din Kursha, surrendered. The Mongols pulled the fortress apart and burned its great library, and much of the knowledge gathered there was lost forever. Centuries later, the British traveler Freya Stark surveyed these valleys in the 1930s and made them famous again in her book, The Valleys of the Assassins. Alamut fell to an empire, but the next fortress guards a mystery no empire has ever solved. We do not even know who built it. Number 4. Ranikot Fort. In the Kurthar Hills of Sindh, in southern Pakistan, about 90 kilometers north of the city of Hyderabad, there is a wall, and it does not stop. It runs over ridge after ridge, following the natural crests of the land like a stone serpent, for somewhere between 26 and 32 kilometers. People call it the Great Wall of Sind. By the length of its outer walls, Ranikot may be the largest fort in the entire world. The ramparts are built of dressed sandstone and rise on average about 6 meters high, close to 20 feet, studded with rounded bastions at intervals along the way. Inside the enormous outer ring sit two smaller fortresses, Miri and Shergar, a second line of defense within the first. A stream called the Reni runs through the interior, which means a garrison here would never have gone thirsty. And here's the strange part. We do not really know who built it, or when, or why. The most common account credits the Talpur rulers of Sind with major construction around 1812, but many historians believe the walls sit on far older foundations, with some pointing to Sasanian-era use, or even earlier, reaching back 1,000 years or more. The site was placed on Pakistan's tentative list for World Heritage status in 1993, and still the basic questions remain open. Then, there is the deepest mystery of all. For a fortress of this staggering size, there is almost no record of it ever being used in a great battle. No famous siege, no decisive war fought at its gates. A wall long enough to swallow a small city, and history is nearly silent about what it was for. Was it a frontier defense against invaders from the north? A refuge for the Talpur rulers? Or the reused strongpoint of some much older power whose name has been erased? The remoteness of the Kurthar Hills is part of the answer to why we know so little. For most of the modern era, few outsiders came here, and few scholars studied it. The Talpurs are recorded spending large sums on the walls in the early 19th century, whatever the true age of the stones beneath. The inner fort of Miri served as the residential and administrative core. Over time, without maintenance, whole sections of the wall have crumbled and slid down the slopes. Conservation teams from Sindh's cultural authorities have tried to stabilize the worst of it, but the essential riddle stands. To walk the full length of these ramparts takes many hours across brutal terrain, and at the end of it, you are left with the same question you started with. Why? Ranikot keeps its secret because its builders left no writing. The next fortress is the opposite. Its stone speaks, in letters carved 2,800 years ago. Number 5. Van Fortress. On the eastern shore of Lake Van, in what is now eastern Turkey, a long spine of limestone rises about 100 meters above the plain. It stretches roughly 1,800 meters from end to end, but it is only 70 to 80 meters wide, a natural wall of rock. And on it stands the oldest fortress in this entire list, older than Rome, older than classical Greece. It was built by a kingdom that most people today have never heard of. Urartu, an Iron Age power that rose around Lake Van and became the great rival of the Assyrian Empire. The earliest fortifications here date to about the 9th century before the Common Era, under a king named Sarduri I. And Sarduri did something that lets his voice reach us across nearly 3,000 years. He carved a foundation inscription into the rock in Assyrian cuneiform around 840 to 830 before the Common Era. His capital here was called Tushpa. The Urartians were master builders in stone. They fitted massive blocks of basalt and limestone, some weighing many tons, into the lower fortifications with real precision. They cut royal tombs directly into the cliff face, deep chambers for their kings. And higher up, on a smoothed panel of rock, is one of the most remarkable inscriptions in the ancient world. It was carved by the Persian king Xerxes I in the 5th century before the Common Era. It is written 3 times over, in Old Persian, in Elamite, and in Babylonian cuneiform, and after 2,500 years, it is still legible. The genius of Urartu was not only in walls, it was in water. Around the year 800 before the Common Era, a king named Minua built a canal roughly 80 kilometers long to bring fresh water to the region. Astonishingly, parts of that canal still carry water today, nearly 3,000 years later. Below the fortress spread the old city of Van, lived in continuously until the early 20th century. Urartu made fine bronze cauldrons, shields, and weapons that were traded across the ancient Near East. The Assyrians campaigned against them again and again. The famous king Sargon II led a great assault in 714 before the Common Era, though the citadel of Tushpa itself held out. The kingdom finally collapsed around the 6th century before the Common Era, absorbed first by the Medes and then by the Persians. After that came layer upon layer of new rulers: Medes, Persians, Armenians, Romans, Byzantines, Seljuks, and Ottomans, each leaving their mark on the rock. The very name Urartu is linked to the word Ararat. This fortress is ancient stone with a voice. The next one is a single tower of rock, 200 meters tall, crowned by a king's guilty conscience. Number 6. Sigiriya. In the middle of the Sri Lankan jungle, a single enormous column of rock erupts out of the flat green plain. It is the hardened core of an extinct volcano, and it rises about 200 meters, close to 660 feet, straight up. On top of it, a king built a palace and a fortress. Its name is Sigiriya, the Lion Rock. The king was Kashyapa I, who ruled from 477 to 495 of the Common Era. And he came to that rock carrying a terrible crime. To seize the throne, Kashyapa is said to have walled up his own father, King Datusena, and left him to die. Then, in fear of his half-brother Moggallana, who had fled and would surely return for revenge, Kashyapa moved his entire capital to the top of this impossible rock, where no army could easily reach him. The summit palace covered about 1.5 hectares. You can still see the foundations of the buildings, a rock-cut throne, and a great cistern carved into the stone. The way up once passed through the body of a colossal lion, built of brick and plaster. Today, only the 2 massive stone paws survive at the base. But they are enough to tell you the whole staircase once climbed through the creature's throat. That is where the name comes from. The Lion Rock. Halfway up, in a sheltered pocket of the cliff, are the famous frescoes known as the Sigiriya Maidens. There may once have been as many as 500 of these painted figures. About 19 survive, still glowing after 1,500 years, painted in a temper technique on the bare rock. Nearby runs the mirror wall, once polished so smooth that the king could see his own reflection as he walked. Over the centuries, visitors covered it in graffiti, and more than 1,800 of their verses have been cataloged, a priceless record of the early Sinhala language. At the base of the rock spread the water gardens, among the oldest surviving landscaped gardens in the world. They used pressure and gravity to run fountains that remarkably still spurt water during the rainy season, more than a millennium after they were designed. The whole complex shows a sophisticated sense of symmetry, possibly modeled on a mythical city of the gods. Kashyapa's story did not end well. When Moggallana finally came, the chronicle called the Kulavamsa tells us that Kashyapa's own troops abandoned him on the field, and the king took his own life. After his death in 495, Sigiriya became a Buddhist monastery, which it remained until about the 14th century. Long before Kashyapa, monks had already sheltered in the rock's caves as far back as the 3rd century, before the Common Era. The British archaeologist H.C.P. Bell began the great excavations here in the 1890s. Kashyapa used a mountain that nature had already made. The next king refused to wait for nature. He built his mountain himself. Number 7. Herodium. About 12 kilometers south of Jerusalem, near Bethlehem, there is a mountain that should not exist. It is a near-perfect cone, symmetrical, rising to about 758 meters above sea level. And it is, in large part, artificial. A king looked at a natural hill, decided it was not grand enough, and ordered his workers to pile earth around it until it became a true peak. The king was Herod the Great, and he built this between roughly 23 and 15 before the Common Era. On top, he set a circular fortress about 63 meters across, ringed by a double wall with 4 towers, one of them a great round tower on the eastern side. According to the historian Flavius Josephus, this was the only place Herod ever named after himself. Herodium. It was meant to be seen. From here, you can look toward Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem you could see the King's Mountain, a permanent monument to his power. Herod did not skimp. Below the fortress, he built a lavish lower palace, a huge pool complex about 70 meters by 46 meters that served as a reservoir and perhaps a place to boat, and Roman-style bathhouses. Water was carried in by an aqueduct from springs near Bethlehem. Vaulted substructures held the palace up on the artificial slope. It was palace, fortress, and monument all at once. And Josephus recorded one more thing. When Herod died, in 4 before the Common Era, he was buried at Herodium. But for centuries, no one could find the tomb. It became one of the great searches in archaeology. A scholar named Ehud Netzer of the Hebrew University hunted for it for more than 35 years. And in 2007, on the northeastern slope, he finally announced that he had found it, along with the smashed fragments of a sarcophagus of reddish limestone. The tomb had been deliberately destroyed, most likely by Jewish rebels who despised Herod. In a tragic turn, Netzer died in 2010 after a fall at the very site he had spent his life searching. Herodium's later history is written in rebellion. During the first Jewish revolt against Rome, fighters seized the fortress and added ritual baths and a synagogue. Decades later, during the second Jewish revolt led by Bar Kokhba, fighters dug an entire network of tunnels through the hill with cisterns and hidden passages, turning Herod's monument into a base for guerrilla war. Herod moved mountains of earth to make his peak, but the next builders moved something far heavier. Stone blocks weighing as much as 100 tons. Number 8. Sacsayhuamán. Above the old Inca capital of Cusco, in Peru, at an altitude of about 3,700 meters, stand 3 great tiers of zigzagging walls. They are built from limestone blocks so enormous and fitted so perfectly that people have been arguing about them for 500 years. This is Sacsayhuamán, and it is the reason so many people believe the ancient world hides secrets we have lost. The largest blocks here weigh well over 100 tons. Some stand as tall as 8.5 meters, and they are shaped into irregular, many-sided forms, then fitted together without any mortar at all, so tightly that you cannot slide a sheet of paper or a knife blade into the joints. Not in one place. Not anywhere. The walls have stood through 5 centuries of earthquakes that have flattened colonial buildings around them, and they have not fallen, because their slightly inward-leaning, mortar-free design lets them flex and resettle when the ground shakes. Mainstream archaeology attributes the walls to the emperor Pachacuti and his successors in the 15th century, though some of the work may reflect the earlier Quilchi culture. The Spanish chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega wrote that tens of thousands of laborers worked for decades to raise them, and that the result seemed almost superhuman. The zigzag shape is often read as the teeth of a puma, for Cusco itself was laid out in the shape of that sacred animal, with Sacsayhuamán as its head. Here is what makes it so hard to believe. The Inca had no wheels for transport, no iron tools, no horses or oxen to pull loads, and yet they quarried these giant stones from sites several kilometers away, moved them across broken mountain terrain, and fitted them by hand, shaping them with harder hammerstones and testing each block again and again until it seated perfectly against its neighbors. The precision is so extreme that fringe theories have flourished, claims of lost technology, of plants that could soften stone, of ancient machines. Mainstream researchers reject all of these, but the honest truth is that the exact methods still amaze the engineers who study them. In 1536, this was the scene of a desperate battle when the forces of Manco Inca besieged the Spanish who had taken Cusco, fighting from these very walls. Afterward, the Spanish quarried away much of the finer, smaller stonework to build their colonial city, which is why mainly the largest, most immovable blocks remain. The great towers that once crowned the heights, including a round tower called Muyuk Marca, were reduced to their foundations. Every June, the Inca Festival of the Sun, Inti Raymi, is reenacted here. If stone this size defies belief, the next site turned an entire desert plateau into the stage for the most famous last stand in the ancient world. Number 9. Masada. On the western shore of the Dead Sea, in the Judean desert of Israel, a great flat-topped rock rises about 400 meters above the desert floor. Its sides are sheer cliffs on every side. The top is a plateau roughly 550 meters by 270 meters, reached in ancient times only by a narrow, twisting track called the Snake Path. This is Masada, and its name means fortress. It was Herod the Great again who turned this natural mesa into a stronghold between about 37 and 31 before the Common Era. He built a spectacular palace in 3 tiers, clinging to the northern cliff face, connected by staircases, hanging out over the drop. He added storehouses, barracks, an armory, cisterns, a Roman bathhouse, and a swimming pool. And he solved the great problem of the desert, water, with an ingenious system that captured the flash floods of the winter wadis and funneled them into huge rock-cut cisterns holding an estimated 40,000 cubic meters. But Masada is remembered for what happened long after Herod. In the year 73 to 74 of the Common Era, after the Romans had crushed the Great Jewish Revolt and destroyed Jerusalem, a group of rebels known as the Sigiriya held out on top of this rock. The Roman commander Flavius Silva came against them with the 10th Legion, some 8,000 to 9,000 soldiers and laborers. He built a wall of circumvallation all the way around the base, and 8 camps, sealing the defenders in. Then the Romans did something extraordinary. They built a giant ramp of earth and stone up the western side of the mountain, a ramp still visible today, to haul a siege tower and a battering ram against the wall. According to Josephus, when they finally broke through, they found almost no one to fight. The roughly 960 defenders had chosen death by their own hands over capture and slavery. Josephus is the only ancient source for this account, and modern scholars still debate how much of it is literally true. The great excavations were led by the Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin from 1963 to 1965. His team uncovered the palaces, one of the oldest known synagogues in the world, ritual baths, and a set of inscribed pottery shards, ostraca bearing names, which some believe were the very lots the defenders drew to decide the order of death. Later, in the 5th and 6th centuries, Byzantine monks built a small church on the summit. In modern Israel, Masada became a national symbol, tied to the vow that Masada shall not fall again. The Roman siege works around its base are among the best preserved anywhere on earth. Masada was besieged, and found, and fought over. The last fortress on our list was never even found by the empire that destroyed all the others. Number 10. Machu Picchu. We end at the most famous mountain fortress in the world, and yet one whose real genius is almost entirely hidden. Machu Picchu sits on a narrow saddle of ridge between 2 peaks, Machu Picchu, the old peak, and Huayna Picchu, the young peak, at an altitude of about 2,430 meters, in the Cusco region of Peru. It was built around 1450, most likely as a royal estate for the Emperor Pachacuti. What you see in the photographs is the top of the story. The elite buildings, like the Temple of the Sun, are made of ashlar masonry, cut granite fitted without mortar, the same seismic smart technique as Sacsayhuamán, with walls that lean slightly inward and flex through earthquakes rather than shatter. But the part that truly should not be possible is underground. Researchers estimate that roughly 60% of the construction effort at Machu Picchu is invisible, buried beneath the surface as deep foundations and layers of crushed rock that drain away the heavy mountain rain and keep the whole city from sliding off its ridge. The Inca were astronomers as well as builders. The carved granite pillar, called the Intihuatana, is thought to have marked the movements of the sun. The window of the Temple of the Sun aligns precisely with the sunrise on the June solstice. The agricultural terraces that cascade down the slopes were not only for growing food, they held the soil in place and stopped the steep hillside from washing away in landslides. Water was carried through the city by a spring-fed system of 16 fountains descending from the high ground. And here is the reason we can still see all of this. The Spanish conquistadors never found Machu Picchu. It was never sacked, never quarried, never destroyed. It slipped out of the wider world's memory and sat quiet on its ridge for centuries. In 1911, the American historian Hiram Bingham was brought up to it by local farmers, families who had been quietly working its terraces the whole time. Bingham was actually searching for Vilcabamba, the last hidden refuge of the Inca, and at first he thought this was that lost city. It was not. But the mistake made Machu Picchu famous. The site holds around 200 structures and probably never housed more than several hundred people, many of them seasonal. Recent studies of DNA from remains found there show a population drawn from all across the Inca Empire, brought together on this one high ridge. It was abandoned around the time of the Spanish conquest, as the Inca state collapsed and disease spread. Machu Picchu was named a World Heritage Site in 1983 and one of the new 7 wonders of the world in 2007. 10 fortresses, 10 mountaintops. And one question that keeps returning. How did they do it, and why did they always reach for the sky? Look back across all 10 of these places, and something surprising emerges. Separated by oceans, by thousands of years, by cultures that never met, they solved the same problems in remarkably similar ways. Again and again, we see walls built without mortar, holding together through nothing but the weight and precise fit of the stone. From Kuelap in the Peruvian clouds to Ranikot in the hills of Sind, we see the same basic recipe, a strong outer face of cut stone, backed by a core of rubble. We see water solved the same way too. A fortress on a mountaintop is useless if a siege can cut off its water. So the builders cut cisterns into the living rock, at Debre Damo, at Alamut, at Masada, and captured every drop of rain and flood they could. The Urartians at Van went further, building a canal 80 kilometers long that still runs today. Water, not walls, was often the true key to survival at altitude. In the earthquake country of the Andes, the Inca learned to make their walls flex. The slightly inward-leaning, mortar-free masonry of Sacsayhuamán and Machu Picchu survives quakes that level modern buildings. The Axumites at Debre Damo laced their stone with timber for flexibility. Each culture found, by patient trial and error, the answer that fit its own ground. There is a shared vocabulary of defense as well. The funnel entrance at Kuelap that squeezed attackers to single file. The leather rope at Debre Damo that could simply be pulled up. The knife-edge ridge at Alamut. The twisting snake path at Masada. In every case, the builders took the one weak point, the way in, and turned it into a trap. And almost everywhere, they built from what the mountain itself gave them. Limestone and sandstone quarried on the spot, or a short distance away, because hauling stone up a cliff from far below was a cost no one could bear. And none of this appeared out of nowhere. Behind every one of these masterworks lies a long learning curve, generations of smaller, rougher structures that taught each culture how to build bigger. The giant polygonal blocks of Sacsayhuamán were the endpoint of centuries of Andean stonework, not a sudden miracle. The drip-ledged monastic caves in the base of Sigiriya were carved 8 centuries before, Kashyapa ever built his palace on the summit. The one ingredient we most often forget is people. Organized, directed, fed, and housed in their thousands. Behind every impossible wall stands an organized state with the power to move a workforce. The stone is what survived. The organization is what made it possible. Which raises the next question. Why go to all this trouble to build so high in the first place? The simplest answer is defense. Height is the oldest advantage in warfare. An attacker climbing toward you is slow, exposed, and exhausted, while you stand rested above them with gravity on your side. A fortress on a peak multiplies the cost of every assault and forces a narrow, predictable line of attack, exactly the single-file killing corridor we saw at Kuelap. But height gave more than defense. It gave sight. From a mountaintop, you can watch the valleys, the roads, and the trade routes for a great distance, and control everything that moves through them. Van watched over its lake and plain. Ranikot guarded a frontier. To hold the high ground was to hold the whole region below. There was also meaning in it. Mountains, in culture after culture, are where the earth reaches toward the heavens, where gods are close. To build on a summit was to make a spiritual claim as much as a military one. Sigiriya may have been modeled on a celestial city. Machu Picchu's temples tracked the sun itself. The fortress and the shrine were often the same building, and height was refuge. When empires fell and enemies closed in, people fled upward. Herod built Masada and Herodium as bolt holes against his own people and his rivals. The Chachapoya retreated into their cloud fortress. Again and again, it is the usurper, the outsider, the hunted king who chooses the mountain, because up there, surrounded by cliffs, he can finally sleep. The high ground answered the deepest human needs at once, for safety, for water, for status, and for closeness to the divine. Yet every one of these places was, in the end, lost, and the ways they were lost form a pattern of their own. For all their strength, these fortresses fell, and rarely to a direct assault on the walls. The most powerful destroyer was invisible: disease. Smallpox and other new sicknesses swept through the Chachapoya and the Inca after European contact, emptying the mountains far more effectively than any army. A fortress cannot hold a wall against a virus. Where armies did succeed, they often did so by patience or by treachery, and then by deliberate erasure. The Mongols did not just take Alamut. They dismantled it and burned its library, wiping out its knowledge on purpose. The Spanish did not just defeat the Inca at Sacsayhuamán. They quarried its stone to build their own city on top of the old one. Destruction was frequently a choice, aimed at the memory of a place as much as its defenses. Others simply outlived their purpose. When the parent state collapsed, as Urartu did, or the Inca did, the great fortresses lost their reason to exist and were quietly abandoned. Then time and weather went to work. Rain, erosion, creeping vegetation, and earthquakes pulled at the walls, as the collapse of part of Kuelap in 2017 still reminds us. Some were transformed rather than destroyed. Sigiriya, the fortress of a guilty king, became a quiet Buddhist monastery for 800 years. Herodium, the monument of a hated ruler, became a rebel base and then a warren of hidden tunnels. A mountain stronghold rarely dies all at once. It changes hands, changes purpose, and slowly fades. And in some cases, the deepest loss was of knowledge itself. Ranikot's builders left no writing, so we cannot say for certain who raised that vast wall, or when, or why. Into that silence rushed legend and myth, filling the gaps that history left empty. But remember this: many of these places were never truly lost. They were only forgotten by outsiders, while local people lived beside them, farmed their terraces, and knew exactly where they were all along, which is why the real work of recovery is still going on today. We are, in a sense, still discovering these fortresses. New tools are pulling their secrets back into the light. LiDAR, a laser scanning technology flown over jungle and cloud forest, can strip away the vegetation in a digital image and reveal structures that no human eye could pick out from the ground. Sites once thought small are turning out to be sprawling. DNA is rewriting the human story of these places. The recent genetic studies of remains from Machu Picchu revealed a community gathered from every corner of the Inca Empire, not a single local population. Careful excavation continues to overturn old certainties. Ehud Netzer spent more than 3 decades at Herodium before he found Herod's tomb. Yigael Yadin's dig at Masada gave us the ostraca that still fuel debate about the final night. Alfredo Narvaez has reshaped how we understand Kuelap. Old assumptions are falling too. The dates of Ranikot are still argued over. The presence of earlier Kilki work at Sacsayhuamán complicates the simple story of Inca genius appearing all at once. Experimental archaeologists now test, with their own hands and ropes and ramps, exactly how such megaliths could have been moved and fitted, and their results keep chipping away at the fringe claims of lost technology. The reputation of the assassins of Alamut has itself been re-examined, and much of the old story revealed as hostile legend. There is a race against time in all of this as well. The same fame that funds preservation brings crowds, and the tread of millions of feet wears at ancient stone and fresco alike, so that conservators must now balance the wish to share these places against the need to protect them. Reading the very stones is part of the work. Scholars still study the trilingual inscription of Xerxes at Van and the Urartian cuneiform around it. And through all of it runs an honest admission. There are things we still cannot fully explain, and the danger is always that fringe theories will rush in to fill a genuine gap. The responsible answer is to keep digging, keep testing, and keep the mystery open rather than answering it with fantasy. 10 fortresses on 10 mountaintops across the whole span of the ancient and medieval world. What ties them together is not a shared people or a shared century. It is a shared impulse, deeply human, to look at the hardest, highest, most impossible ground available, and to say, that is where we will build. The phrase that titles this journey, that they should not be possible, is really a confession about us. It measures how badly we tend to underestimate the people who came before. They had no engines and no steel, and yet they raised walls that have outlasted the empires that feared them, and shrugged off earthquakes that flatten our own construction. The intelligence is right there, encoded in a joint so tight a knife cannot enter it, in a canal that has run for 3,000 years. Each of these places answered the same handful of eternal needs. Safety from those who would do you harm. Water enough to endure. Meaning, and a place near the sky where the gods might listen. And power, made visible in stone for everyone below to see. What survives on those summits is the rock. What was lost, so often, is the exact knowledge of how it was done, and the names of the countless hands that did it. So the next time you see a mountain, look a little longer at the summit. Somewhere in the world, on ground just like that, people once hauled stone and timber and water up a cliff by rope and by will, and made something that has lasted longer than they could ever have dreamed. They refused the easy, level ground, and because they did, they left us these silent giants in the clouds, still keeping their secrets, still asking us to explain them.